you so much for coming to your Liberty Fringe meeting of 2013.
I feel more comfortable living in a state where from time to time I go in and want to bang my head against the door with frustration at what I see as a silly decision by judges in an individual case, than to live in a society where there's no ability to enforce rights. And as society gets more complex, as the power of the state intrudes more, rights protection actually does make sense. Our forebears knew it made sense. That's why they had the Bill of Rights of 1689. That's why actually they had Magna Carta, because it added to the common law rights they already had and which were insufficient for them to protect them from the state. And there's a long history in this, so there's not something unusual about having human rights. On the contrary, it follows in a long tradition of English common law development. But that's not to say we always get it right. We're a human society. There will always be examples of judicial decisions which are probably wrong. But the question is, how do we tackle this problem in a way which leads to a satisfactory long-term outcome for this country? And that's what I'm committed to trying to help my colleagues achieve.
That was my
We can pull out from the convention. It's an international treaty. We have to give 6 months' notice. If we leave it, then we have to take the international reputational consequences of doing so. It's a cost-benefit analysis in terms of whether we will benefit from doing it and what the downsides are. Some of the downsides have already been commented on, and I think they're fairly obvious. One of which is that as it's a very important working treaty, it must be quite likely that the treaty may collapse, actually, and that countries which currently have accepted the jurisdiction of the court and which have
like
poor
Russia.
Human rights
Like
records,
Russia.
but which have at least been subject to a lot of pressure, will see that pressure removed. The principles get interpreted by judges. They get interpreted by judges here or judges in Strasbourg. But actually, and one of the things you've got to face up to is if the principles are there will be occasions where the judicial interpretation is going to vex and irritate politicians and indeed the readership of the Daily Mail. And that will happen whether or not we are members of the convention or whether we've got our own Supreme Court looking at the same thing. I promise you that is what will happen. There may be some rights which you forfeit if you don't behave responsibly. But the principle of human rights has always been that however ghastly you are, there are certain irreducible rights which should not be violated. You know, this is what the argument over Abu Qatada was actually all about, when the Daily Mail was saying, oh, just shove him on a plane. But that was not permitted because potentially it was a violation of his rights in relation to what might happen to him in Jordan. In fact, we solved that problem brilliantly, successfully, actually, I think, and all credit to the Home Secretary, and it was a pleasure to help her in that process. We got round it the right way. But I certainly don't subscribe to the view that just because somebody behaves very badly, it means that all their rights get forfeited. There's also, of course, the Gibson inquiry, and I'm sorry that it's had to be halted because of the criminal investigations. That's only proper. We live in a rule of law state. We can't prejudice the criminal inquiries. But I do hope that what was found by Gibson is a preliminary will be published as soon as possible. It's not the government that is, I can assure you, not desirous of seeing that happen. But the government's position is unequivocal on this. We do not sanction inhuman, degrading treatment or torture, even towards those who may have committed murder. Absolutely not. It's a central tenet of British policy position, and we intend to try to make sure that that percolates right down to the bottom, and where there are suggestions that in fact breaches have occurred, that they will be investigated and if necessary prosecuted.
What, didn't we send some British citizens to Guantanamo on the orders of the Foreign Secretary? Isn't there a British citizen still in Guantanamo? Absolutely disgusting.
British resident.
We didn't send him there. British resident still in Guantanamo. The Gibson inquiry, which was set up by this government, was a pathetic apology for an inquiry. Gibson was wholly unsuitable. He should have been under investigation, not the man carrying out the inquiry. And one of the problems of inquiries, as we know, when they're done by people who are part of the system being investigated, they rarely produce satisfactory outcomes.
I haven't the slightest doubt that the Crown Prosecution Service wishes to be very proactive in dealing with female genital mutilation. just indeed as it's put a great emphasis in the last 4 to 5, 6 years. It's actually lapsed over again. I'm always very fair about the last government, but about violence against women, which has been one of the top agenda priorities of the CPS, and indeed has shown very considerable results. However, it's right, you're absolutely right, and the questioner is right in saying that female genital mutilation, albeit we don't know its extent it takes place in this country, we have some evidence it's certainly happening, it's a very difficult crime to prosecute, for reasons which I think are fairly obvious, because it tends to be a crime with a victim, and unless the victim comes forward, which will in many cases mean the disruption of family relationships, it's unlikely that we will very often hear about it. And the evidence may be hard to come by.
I would be absolutely horrified, not only people outside of my immediate circle, let alone strangers and officials who are supposed to trust implicitly, knew not only who I communicated with regularly, because they'd find out all my contacts, they'd find out the people who source stories for me, they'd find out who I may be seeing that I shouldn't be seeing, they would find out. Part of the problem is that there's so little trust left now in the organisations who would be accessing this information that we do not believe their promises. That's the simple fact. And I find it absolutely horrific that things about my family's mental health, my family's personal life, anything like that, we know, and my own, and my friends, and everyone who communicates with me would just end up being fair game, and it would happen, and I think it's just wrong.